In today's Russia, this takes courage. Some 500 young Russians shouted shame over and over outside the Supreme Court on Monday, daring to protest openly despite the risks. Demonstrating in Russia is dangerous. The Kremlin has a zero-tolerance policy, and yet here are the police, mostly looking on. Only a handful of arrests were made, but unsanctioned public dissent can result in violence, heavy financial penalties and long-term imprisonment. But not this time. Why? What drove these Russians onto the streets of Moscow to risk their lives, and why were organisers handing out apples? On Monday, the Supreme Court excluded the liberal opposition Yabloko party from next month's parliamentary election. The first time that this has happened to a party after having been granted approval to participate. So why the sudden change of heart? Why was the party included in the first place? And is Putin scared of apples? Yuri Resheto used to report from Moscow before our office was shut down by authorities and relocated to Riga. Russian security analyst Natya Seskuria joins us from the Royal United Services Institute, a defence think tank in London. Yuri, why was the party struck from the electoral list, first of all?
Well, Ben, look, what happened in court looked more like a political show than a legal process. I would say some of the accusations against Yabloko were so strange that they were hard to take seriously. At one point, the party was, for example, accused of plagiarism because it uses an apple as its symbol and calls for peace in its program. The party's calls for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine to stop the war were also presented as extremism and as going against the goals of Russia's so-called special military operation. That is what Russian authorities put the war in Russian. Take together, it looked as if every possible argument, no matter how weak, was being used to justify banning the party from the election. That's why many people believe the real decision was made somewhere above the court, and in Russia, that ultimately means the Kremlin.
Of course, Yabloko means apple in Russian. It's also the symbol of the party, as Yuri points out. Natya, is Putin scared of apples?
Well, I think it is clear that the Russian authorities and Russian elites are becoming increasingly insecure when it comes to allowing even some sort of nominal symbolic pluralism within the Russian elections. Of course, I doubt that Yabloko's participation would have changed the overall result of the elections. I'm sure it wouldn't. But it's clear that Yabloko has some support when it comes to young people, especially those who have been deprived to express their anti-war sentiments. And the party presents a platform for those who disagree with Russia's war against Ukraine to cast their votes and at least legally support the party that is openly against Russia's war effort. I think with this decision, it is clear that the Kremlin wants to eliminate all sorts of potential threats that may occur as a result of Yabloko's participation in these elections. Even if Russians will try to protest against this decision, of course there are tools that the Kremlin has been using against the protesters, the demonstrators, to crack down on them. So it is quite a tragic situation when it comes to eliminating all sorts of opposition voices within Russia, and Yabloko was probably one of the last ones.
Well, let's listen into what some of the demonstrators actually told reporters.
We would like to support Yabloko so that they are able to participate in elections. We think it is essential we show that there are lots of us, that we are united in our support for this party, because we all want peace and we want a brighter future.
It is very important to support the Yabloko party now, because it is constantly under pressure and being excluded from electoral lists. The same thing is happening in St. Petersburg. Kruglov was recently imprisoned and Schlossberg is now on trial. It's simply important. This kind of consolidation of people in one place is very encouraging right now. Overall, we've not been expecting anything good recently, but maybe they'll let Yabloko participate. It wouldn't be bad.
Yuri, we heard there some of those protesters talking about jailed opposition figures. Isn't it dangerous, though, for them to be voicing dissent to the media?
Well, Ben, look, these days in Russia, almost anything that goes against the official line can be risky, especially when it comes to what the authorities call the special military operation in Ukraine. People have been detained for standing alone with a blank sheet of paper and saying nothing at all. Authorities can accuse them of discrediting the Russian armed forces, and in some cases that can lead to serious criminal charges. One important point about the young people outside the courthouse yesterday, they were not speaking directly to Deutsche Welle. The W is banned in Russia and has been labeled an undesirable organization. The people we are talking about gave interviews to Russian media outlets or Western news agencies that are still officially allowed to operate in Russia. As for why police made so few arrests, that may simply have been a practical decision. Look, the authorities may have concluded that it was better to let a few hundred young people vent their frustration than to crack down and turn a small protest, a pretty small protest, into a much bigger story.
Natia, couldn't there be long-term consequences for these demonstrators, though? I know Moscow has a huge network of AI-powered cameras. Online dissent is monitored as well. And if they're students, I mean, they could be expelled from their universities, couldn't they?
Yes, absolutely. The Kremlin has a well-established repression toolkit that they have been using for a very long time now. And this toolkit involves administrative fines, short-term detention, for instance, that has been reinforced against many protesters and students. There are criminal liabilities with prison terms involved. So they have various tools for repression. And unfortunately, anyone who will try to go against the regime and protest and support the end of Russia's war against Ukraine faces these charges. And it's quite risky for the people who are out and trying to support the party, because all of them essentially face these repression tools.
And definitely a horrible situation, considering if you're out there protesting against the war and end up in jail. I've heard of cases of detainees being forced into military conscription, so to fight in the war.
Yes, absolutely. That is potentially one of the worst case scenarios for the protesters. And I think everybody understands that being directly dragged into this war is a huge risk for their lives. And even those Russians who are maybe not leaned towards and maybe not opposition-minded are trying to avoid being directly dragged into Russia's war effort. And I think it's precisely because of the changes in the mood overall in terms of Russians facing growing economic hardships, as well as looking at the current situation with Ukraine's successful drone attacks against Russia. Russians are feeling extremely insecure, and even those vocal voices who were supporting the war are now trying to sort of be a little bit more moderate and support the negotiations path. We have seen this trend, even though there is also a significant portion that still supports the war and the escalation scenario. There are more people supporting the end of the war against Ukraine. And I think it is precisely because of the reason that we saw these changes and the banning of Yabloko, because they are potentially a platform for those Russians who are against the continuous war effort to get together and support this cause.
Yuri, tell me more in a moment about this party and its prospects. First, let's listen in to Yabloko's chairman responding to the court decision. Sorry, let's just listen in to what he had to say.
We have 5 days. And we will appeal this decision at the Supreme Court. And we'll do everything possible for this decision to be overturned in the framework of the law. We'll do everything possible for Yabloko to be on the ballot papers of next State Duma's election. That is why, in the future, we have a major common path together, and we have a major and important task to stop, together, the death of people, to bring peace back, to save human lives. Everything that we do must be dedicated to that. I am asking you to come to us and to continue this work with us. We'll do this, and we'll achieve these goals. Thank you.
Yuri, does this liberal opposition anti-war party have a future?
Considering that more than 1,000 people are in jail already for political reasons. I just wanted to add to what Nadia said previously. And yes, to your question now, Yabloko itself hasn't been a major political force for years, Ben. It's not represented in parliament and has only around 20,000 members. The last time it made it into the State Duma was in 1999, when it won almost 6% of the vote. Its co-founder, Grigory Yavlinsky, even ran for president in 2018. But the party still matters. It has strong regional branches, especially in St. Petersburg, Pskov, in Karelia, and in recent years it has attracted more young supporters, particularly after the death of opposition leader Alexei Navalny and the collapse of his movement inside Russia. That seems to be exactly what worried the authorities. As for the future, to your question, it's possible the pressure on Yabloko will only increase. Several figures linked to the party have already faced problems with the authorities. Some have been labeled foreign agents. The party's deputy chairman is currently in prison, and party leader Nikolai Rybakov has already faced politically motivated accusations. So the next step could be an attempt to go after the party itself, potentially branding it extremist and banning it altogether. That said, it's impossible to know how far the authorities are prepared to go. What is clear, Ben, is that the space for any legal anti-war activity inside Russia has become even smaller than it was before.
Nadia, could you explain how this party has managed to survive for all this time? It sounds like a very tricky balancing act.
Yes, absolutely. And many opposition leaders in exile especially have blamed the party for being a little bit too soft when it comes to their standing with regards to the war in Ukraine, even though they claim that they are supporting the ceasefire and negotiations and the end to the war. Still, they haven't been as critical as some of Ukraine's supporters may wanted them to be in terms of denouncing Russia's war crimes against Ukraine. But one may also argue that this is the only way they have been able to survive within the Russian political scene, because, as you know, any sort of criticism of the Russian army, of Russia's war against Ukraine, may eventually end up in criminal charges against the leaders or the activists that are trying to voice these criticisms in public. So that may be one of the reasons why they still had the space to operate within a very limited Russian political scene. But I think what is quite clear right now is that Kremlin doesn't think that they can afford any sort of opposition voices, especially when it comes to the elections, even though, of course, everybody understands that these elections are very much staged and a symbolic act of democracy, which doesn't exist in Russia anymore. But still, it gives an opportunity for those Russians who have supported Alexei Navalny's movement or other opposition leaders in the past and who are against the war to have their leaders, to have their political party to support and cast their votes during the September elections.
Well, Navalny's wife spoke out about Monday's news. Yulia writing on X that Monday's ruling showed the Kremlin is scared. She wrote, "They saw what they didn't want to see. People are beginning to unite." Yuri, this was just a few hundred people. Would you go as far as saying that people are uniting all of a sudden?
Well, look, I think to answer that, just look at what happened exactly outside the courthouse in Moscow. Yes, hundreds of supporters gathered there throughout the day. Most were young people, many under 30. For some, it was their first political protest, surely. People handed out apples, a symbol of the party. Others wore Yabloko T-shirts. It was completely peaceful, but that's exactly what made it important. These young people were openly supporting an anti-war party. In today's Russia, that takes courage. 500 people may not sound like much in a city of 16 million, Moscow, but what matters is that they showed up at all. Yabloko has also gained support online in recent weeks because of its anti-war stance. What we saw outside the court was a reminder that anti-war sentiment still exists in Russia, and that's something that unites people, and that's something that makes authorities nervous. Not the result of the upcoming election, whether the ruling party will get 70% or 65 or even 60. No, what matters for the ruling party, for the Kremlin, is the control above the mood in the country.
Natya, how much more of the war can Russians take? I mean, Ukraine is increasingly taking the war to Russia. They've created a fuel crunch, and more body bags are being sent back from Ukraine.
Yes, that's a very important question. I think now we see that there are more Russians that are becoming increasingly worried about the course of this war. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are not supporting Putin's regime. There is still a significant portion of Russians who are supporting Putin and his imperial ambitions when it comes to Ukraine. But I think the fact that Ukraine is bringing war closer to the Russians and the Russian households is very much important, and that may eventually shift more Russians' opinions about how this war should continue and if the war should continue at all or not. I think the fact that there are economic hardships that Russia is experiencing now is very important, in a sense that if the current state of economy will continue to deteriorate, then I think the impact of the war will be felt more gravely among the Russian population. And of course, there is an overwhelming fear of another wave of mobilization, something that Putin has been trying to avoid throughout the past couple of years, because the first wave of partial mobilization has not been supported by many Russians and has not been endorsed by wider population. But at the same time, I think Ukraine is increasingly shrinking Putin's maneuvering space in that sense. There is, of course, an option to go back to the negotiation table, something that many people are hoping and want to see. But at the same time, I don't really think that there is a breaking point right now, in which case Putin would seriously consider making concessions on going back to the negotiation table. I think he still thinks that he can retain the control over the masses with the propaganda and with the message box that the Kremlin is pushing through, and he still hopes to have ways in which he can escalate the conflict so that Russia is able to gain more ground and to negotiate in the future perspective with a position of strength rather than the position of weakness.
Okay, Natya, thank you very much for your analysis and for spending time with us today. Yuri, thank you for your reporting from Riga. What are your hopes for the upcoming elections in Russia? Let me know. I'm Ben Fazulin in Berlin. I'll see you again soon.